The word genocide and its legal definition were coined after World War II, after the mass atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. However, the crimes associated with the genocide had existed for decades, if not centuries, before the word came to exist. The Herero and Nama genocide by German colonial settlers in present-day Namibia is one such example. This genocide took place between 1904 and 1908 in what was then German-occupied Southwest Africa, currently the territory of Namibia. About 75% of the entire Herero population and about 50% of the Nama population died during this campaign. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the events surrounding this first genocide of the 20th century. In 1885, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened a meeting for European powers known as the Berlin Conference to discuss the scramble and partition of the continent of Africa. Bismarck declared Southwest Africa a German colony suitable not only for trade but for European settlement. Belgium's King Leopold II meanwhile seized the Congo and France claimed control of West Africa. The semi-arid territory of the then Southwest Africa that the Germans planned to occupy was more than twice as large as Germany, yet it only had a fraction of the population, approximately 250,000 people. In contrast to Germany's other African possessions, this territory offered little promise for large-scale mineral or agricultural extractions. Instead, Southwest Africa became Germany's only real settler colony. By 1903, some 3,000 Germans had settled in the colony, primarily on the central high grounds. During this period, some German merchants did trade peacefully with the locals. But like Belgians in the Congo and the British in Australia, the official German policy was to seize the territory that Europeans considered empty, when it most definitely was not. At the time, there were 13 tribes living in Namibia, of which two of the most powerful were the Nama and the Herero. During the early period of colonization by the Germans, the Herero people were far more economically and socially powerful than the Germans, keeping German colonization at bay. Some German arrivals depended on locals who raised cattle and sold them land. They even enacted a rule that protected Herero land holdings. But the ruling was controversial. Many German farmers felt that Southwest Africa was theirs for the taking. Unfortunately, in 1897, the rinderpest disease struck Southwest Africa, killing up to 90% of the Herero cattle herds. This plague significantly weakened the Herero both physically by destroying their source of protein and economically by wiping out their source of wealth. With the Herero weakened, the Germans became even more brutal in their colonial policies. Occasionally though, a group of Herero and Nama would rise up against the Germans, but to little avail. For the tribes in Southwest Africa, everything changed in 1904. The tensions in the colony had risen to a peak. Under the leadership of the paramount chief, Samuel Maherero, the downtrodden Herero rose up against their colonizers in a widespread rebellion. This rebellion quickly turned into a war. The fighting began on the 12th of January 1904. In the following weeks, fighting rippled out across the central high grounds. Seeking to gain control of the situation, Samuel Maherero issued specific rules of engagement that precluded violence against women and children. Nevertheless, 123 settlers and soldiers were killed in these attacks, including at least 4 women. Major Theodor Ludwig, the military commander and the governor of the colony, was in charge of the German response. Since the Herero were well armed and significantly outnumbered the German colonial garrison, he favored a negotiated settlement of the conflict. However, these peace talks to bring the conflict to an end broke down, and when Berlin received word of the collapse of the talks, as well as the death of white German subjects, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the then German monarch, sent not only new orders, but a new leader of German troops to Southwest Africa. The new leader was Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, who took over as the colonial governor, and with his arrival, the rhetoric of forceful negotiations gave way to a rhetoric of racial extermination. Von Trotha issued an infamous German order which, translated into English, meant an extermination order. Von Trotha's order read, "The Herero are no longer German subjects. The Herero people will have to leave the country. If the people refuse, I'll force them with cannons to do so. Within the German boundaries, every Herero, with or without firearms, with or without cattle, will be shot." I won't accommodate women and children anymore. I shall drive them back to their people, or I shall give the order to shoot at them. Given these circumstances, the Herero rebellion stood no chance of success against this oppressive German occupation of the region. The locals had their wells poisoned and food supplies cut. Many were killed in combat, including during the Battle of Waterberg. Others died of dehydration in the desert. In 1905, the Nama people also responded with a band of guerrilla fighters to also fight the Germans. They were led by Hendrik Witbooi. After a year of fierce fighting, Witbooi was killed in action, but Jacob Marengo continued to lead the Nama resistance for a further 2 years. In 1907, the death of Marengo brought about the end of the War of Resistance by the Nama and the Herero people. Based on the British example in Southern Africa of rounding up the enemy, civilians as well as combatants, and confining them to camps, the Germans introduced a system of human enclosures, of which translated to English the term meant concentration camps. These camps were set up in the largest town where the need for labor was greatest. Over the next 3 years, Herero prisoners, mainly women and children, were rented out to local businesses or were forced to work on government infrastructure projects. The conditions of work were so severe that more than half of all prisoners died within the first year. Those imprisoned in concentration camps died of disease and exhaustion. All the remaining Herero lands were confiscated and the people were forbidden to keep cattle. Like the Herero, the Nama also ended up in concentration camps. The vast majority were sent to Shark Island camp off the coast of the harbour town of Luderitz. The prisoners from these concentration camps were used as slave labor to build railways, docks, and buildings throughout the country. It is estimated that up to 80% of the prisoners on Shark Island died there. Groups of Nama were even deported to German colonies in West Africa. Exposed to forced labor under climatic conditions that they weren't used to, only a few survivors were repatriated from these German colonies back to Namibia towards the end of German colonial rule. The Nama and Herero genocide resulted in the annihilation of approximately 80% of the Herero people and 50% of the Nama. This translates to between 65,000 and 100,000 Herero and about 10,000 of the Nama people. Germany was eventually forced out of the colony in 1915 when it was overpowered by South Africa. Unfortunately, the brutal squalor of the locals in Southwest Africa didn't end here. The hopes of the inhabitants of Southwest Africa for redress of grievances when the Union government of South Africa took over the territory were soon dashed. During the period starting from 1922 to 1946, the indigenous people were allocated 10.6% to as little as 3.6% of the national budget. Even though about 6,000 Germans had left the country, grazing lands that were seized by the German colonial government was not restored to its rightful owners. Instead, pastoral chiefdoms and communities were dispossessed, and almost half the territory was allocated to some 3,000 white settler ranches that were heavily subsidized. Descendants of the few survivors from the genocide are seeking $4 billion compensation from the German government for what they claim was an orchestrated campaign of extermination. To this end, the countries of Namibia and Germany have been in talks since 2015 to negotiate compensation for the massacre by German colonial forces. As of August 2020, 8 rounds of negotiations had taken place between the two countries. A few months back, in 2020, reports came from Namibian President Hage Geingob that the Germans had put an offer of 10 million euros on the table as compensation. He was also quoted saying, "The current offer for reparations made by the German government remains an outstanding issue and is not acceptable to the Namibian government." He went on to state that the two countries would continue to negotiate a revised offer. So my question to you is this: what do you think is a fair offer by Germany as compensation for this genocide? Let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and share the video if you found it insightful and informative. Also, if you're new here and are interested in learning about African history and notable events occurring across the continent, then don't be shy to subscribe and to click the notifications bell so that you don't miss out on any new uploads. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.